Welcome everyone. This is Tristan McGough, your Philosopher today, which serves as your host as we discuss the Pyramid of Selfhood. This is part of the intermediate Selfology seminar that we've been pursuing. And today we're going to look at the axis of identity and the arena of identification of that identity and the appearance of individuality. Now, our touchstone here is the cognostic card that regards the 7 intuitional ideas of self. These are pristine cognitions that arise naturally. That is, none of us need to learn how to see the world through these 7 ideatic frames, these ideas, these quite ultra and universal ideas that arise naturally in each of our cognition. We all see the world as one thing. We all see the world, whatever it is, as being all and everything. We all see the world as a conscious being, as consciousness, and relatable to our own conscious being. We all see the world in ordered perspective as a cosmos, with a whole that includes many layers and divisions within divisions, and particles with subatomic particles, and even particles beyond that. So these 7 ideas we've been treating within intermediate Selfology as well as Selfology 101. And today we're taking a distillation of what we've talked about from the last time, where we spoke of who I am. That is, we all have a basic sense of I. Now, that is the cognos. That is a very specific one of these 7 intuitional ideas, as cognos, as conscious being, as the psychological person that we are, that has either the surface appearance only as the empirical side for certain psychologists and materialists, but for other people that go into deep psychology, there is, of course, the psyche and the transfinite realm that they are investigating. And then even beyond that, with transpersonal psychologists who look into the universal aspect of consciousness that we all share, such as in the transpersonal and the unitive consciousness of I-Thou. Now remember, consciousness confers identity, as identity certifies consciousness. These 7 layers are levels, if you will, of identity. The greater includes the lesser, so that at no point is there ever a severance of entities from one another, nor is there a time where they are simply acting as the single lens or focus upon which we view the world. We don't stop viewing the world as all and everything at the same moment that we are intuiting it as one, as a united being that is the basis, or if you will, the substratum, which allows us to communicate, that allows us to interface, that allows us to appear to one another. So I've taken these 7 levels and I've broken them down according to the cognography, the map, if you will, the landscape of the human consciousness, which we had spoken of in terms of the 7 levels in terms of identity and identification. Now, those 7 levels actually are nothing more than this cognography of human existence, in which, beginning at the very top with the infinite, we have the aonal realm, the cognal, the intuitive, egoic, mentive, emotive, and physical. The physical includes both the subatomic structural elements and the dark energy and the dark matter that physicists are dealing with, as well as the corporeal, macroscopic world that we deal in with tangibles and perceivables. I've taken that and I've really just reduced that, if you will, to these rather color-coded identifications, so that everything that relates to the identity and the aspect of identity is in purple, everything that relates to will is in green, everything that relates to the mind, remember we're dealing here with the 5 fundamental modes of consciousness, the intuition, volition, green. When it comes to the mind, represent that in blue, and then the feeling element is in this yellowish orange, and then in the red is the life, the vivus. That's all color coordinated here for those who are looking and are studying the various levels from all the way through I and the I am and the I thou that relates each of those to what are known in occultism or esoteric philosophy as the 7 planes of existence, which are the fields of Aussia. These are the fields of vibration in which consciousness manifests all of its powers, so that no given time is consciousness without its correspondent element of being. We can take that and reduce it quite simply into what I call the Pyramid of Selfhood, where we can easily see that there is an I axis. That is identity. That is pure identity. And that in that I axis, it is structured according to, if you will, the denser vibrations that go all the way from Brahman, according to Vedanta terminology, or what I call the aeon, all the way from the aeon down to the physical. So I've correlated it with Sanskrit terminology, which is well known to those who have studied any of the ageless wisdom. However, what is very unique is demonstrating the structure, if you will, for the arena of identification, in which all is seen as one at the level of Brahman is the aeon. There is the one. But in terms of conscious being, consciousness and being, that is the I am. And that's the Atman. That's the individual microcosmic reflection of the macrocosm. The intuitive is I, thou, and in Sanskrit terminology, this includes buddhi. This is all the intelligence faculties. As I was speaking of them before, if you were to break them down, you would be seeing that you have, of course, the thou, the ethos, the logos, the pathos, relating to feeling, and of course, the bios, to life, the logos with mind. And that relates to the various intuitive senses that we have. We have the sense absolutely of centered certainty and presence, and that's the axiomatic sense. We have the sense of goodness, that's the archaic sense. Sense of beauty, the aesthetic sense. The sense of truth, the alethic sense, and the sense of authenticity, the auctorial sense, the sense of being author of one's own actions and ideas and inner states and outer behavior. Back to our axis, I call attention that identity is identity throughout. We, remember, St. Francis, And what he had said, what we are looking for is what is looking. And in omnism, which is a general term which is used for all of these 7 ideas, however they've been espoused in the perennial philosophy, in the various versions of the ageless wisdom that has been articulated in the Occident and the Orient. However that is, in terms of omnism, what we are looking for is who is looking. And that who is looking is the axis of identity that remains ever the same. And yet, of course, it houses, if you will, the different relational structures, all the way from I am, existing, that art thou, through the I thou and the various faculties of logos, pathos, etc., to the I me, where I see that I have a core and that I have contents, that I am constantly generating ideas in the form of feelings and willings and thinkings and doings. And then there is the I other, which is the discriminative faculty of intelligence or intellect, if you will, that allows us to see things as genre and species, as classes of concepts that hold other subclasses of concepts. So it allows us finer and finer grades of distinction and greater arena of generalization in capturing truth or even beauty in terms of art. The emotive is I, us. It's where we see that we have particular relationships with which we identify, and this basically is the basis of course, of our social growth. And it relates keenly to the emotive plane, or what has been called the astral or the karmic plane in theosophy. The physical, the rupa, in terms of the Sanskrit terminology, is the ayat. Everything is divided up. This isn't it, 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 fingernail is it. You keep going down to the lower and lower levels of it, of course. There's the cellular structure, then the molecular and the atomic, and the subatomic, and beyond that. So what we are looking for here in terms of an explanation of selfhood is that the self, whatever plane it's on, and that includes us as a complete individual being, where if we stop and we look at this, we're going to see quite easily that this entire field is every single one of us represented as an individuality, because we have unique bodies, physical bodies. We have unique affective sets of emotions. We have unique mental beliefs and outlooks on life. We have a unique sense of self and an I maker who generates constantly thoughts and the internal world. We have a unique relationship with the united factor of I, thou. We couldn't possibly have a sense of I without there being a thou. And we couldn't have any sense of being as either an I or a thou if we did not exist as an I am at the most fundamental level of being, other than the ground. So here we see represented the identity remains the same. However, what we identify with on each of the various planes or fields of ousia, the planes of being, in which the sets of entities and causes and time and space are connected in such a fashion that they immediately have an interactional ability, whereas feelings interacting with the physical plane does not have that kind of interaction because there is not a physical agent which is transacting energy with another physical agent. These are different energy levels. The physical is much denser. In terms of materiality, it is much more solid. And although there's solid, liquid, and gas, and the transformative elements, and plasma and subatomic particles, they're all pretty definite its that can pretty well be identified. But when it comes to the emotive or the imaginal plane, that's something altogether different in terms of the kind of energy that is sensed and that is lived in. It can't be scientifically discerned by the instruments of this world because it is not of this world. It is quite subtler. And that is the same as you move upward along the period. There are subtler grades of energy. And therefore, when we're talking about the physical plane and the physical body that you see me inhabit, remember, it is not a strata that exists by itself. It is interpenetrated with the emotive, the inventive, the egoic, the intuitive, the cogno, and above all, the ground, the aeonal ground. All of these different fields are vibrating at the same time along this axis, which is a single thing. This gives sense to each of us having a unique individuality, which is an expression of that central identity, that axis of identity. We're all quite convinced that we have a singular axis, and indeed we do. The fact that we can share a sense of beauty, for instance, at the intuitive level, as part of our buddhi or our buddhic faculties, and we have this aesthetic sense, and we can appreciate a beautiful painting, or a fine sunset, or an exquisite dinner, or the love that's expressed our way, or a gift given. All of these appreciative elements that we feel. We don't have to think about them. We don't will them. We don't have to do them. We feel them. It's a completely different mode of consciousness, isn't it? Feeling is totally different than thinking. And these are totally different than willing. But all of these are part of united wisdom that we share. It isn't as if I have my own sense of beauty or you have your own sense of beauty. You have your own interpretations of the sense of beauty that exist and that we share at a higher level of being through your egoic processes where you generate what you believe are the beauties you have experienced in the world of the I-it, or that you've imagined in the emotive world of the imagination and of the appetites, or that you've thought about either as a thought exercise or you've read in a novel, and that therefore you've been able to make distinctions and associations, which is what happens with the intelligence, the intellect aspect. As you can tell, the actual basis of self, if we were to look at it along this axis in which we're going to have these identifications, we will identify with the stuff around us in the world through our body. That's the physical. We are going to have groups that we form according to the relationships that we affectively build at a non-physical, above physical, an ultra-physical level of emotions, imaginations, of karma. And then the distinctions that we have as an intellect, we create associations. These associations we call beliefs and doctrines and presumptions and netted propositions and inferential chains and theories, etc., etc. But we have a core that is constantly generating a sense of self, individual, personal self. And that is the I, me, that structure. There is a core with contents, and that's the egoic. That is very important because that's where the epistic and the empiric self split off. That's where the finite world that you apprehend through your senses and are part of the empiric self are split off and become part of the transfinite world that you experience as a psyche, and that pull past time. Time becomes the events that on a lower level are unfurled as I other, as you think about the episodes of your life. But at the moment that you are generating them, you are generating this as a pure subject looking for the object, which is itself, the me. And everything that is generated within that self as core, right here, that is split off into the me, is having a bifurcated existence. There's what you experience now as the me as you explain it, with physical words, with actual feelings right here, right now. That's your empiric self. However, that is along a long chain of continuity of consciousness, which we call the epistic self. That is the self that doesn't operate through producing ideas, it generates ideas. And it always generates them in the context of I and me. It's always my thought. It's always my feeling. It's always my will, my resolution, etc., etc., etc. Above that, however, is the intuital, the I-thou. The individual ego cannot exist without reference to a thou. The individual ego is birthed from the I-thou, in the same way that the I-it is birthed from the I-us. Think of your mother and father. Think of them existing as an us before you became an it as a body. It existed before, not just as potential, but it actually existed in the net of cause, entity, time, and space. At the very top of it all, we have Brahman, the all, the one. What I've attempted to indicate here on the intuitive, we have a presence, right? But you don't just have a self-presence, you have a presence of thou. You have a presence of that which is greater and which you are subsumed under as part of that greater scape. You have your inner scape, you have your outer scape, but you realize that both of those exist only as potentials on the inner scape, the greater scape. So the inner scape itself can recognize the greater scape, that it's part of a universal whole. And that's exactly at the point where consciousness understands that the being that it has is being. It's not just something that does not exist. Consciousness is what actually creates identity. And your identity will certify consciousness at various levels of identification. So at the very top, you have the aeonal ground that we all share, and from here on, it becomes more and more differentiated, the more that each of us, as an individual, interact with one another, as well as unfurl all the various elements of ourselves. So that eventually you can look and you can say, all right, generally, not exclusively, but instinct and developed, awakened instinct within the wisening human being leads to practical wisdom. You know how to do things in this world. You know how to do them quite well. They can be technical skills, they can be business, interpersonal skills, whatever. You know how to practice in this finite world of I-it. In the same way, you develop social wisdom through imagination. You empathize with others. You speculate on the world. You learn to immerse yourself in another person's worldview or into a novelist's egoic world where they are interacting and you are assuming imaginatively different identities. All of that develops social wisdom. Scientific wisdom, the result of the intellect that is able to discern the distinctions and what these associations mean. Just as personal wisdom develops through intelligence, where you coordinate and understand that everything that you think, feel, do, and will is part of what you, as an intuitive center, that has a degree of mastery over. And we've discussed this in terms of the mastery of the mystery. And then united wisdom, which is what occurs through intuition in the same way that insight reveals universal wisdom, and one, illumination, the Buddha nature, the consciousness is pure consciousness, as the ground that is clear, free of all obstruction, and knowing. That is, it has all possible potentials existing within it in which it radiates. It is always radiating. That consciousness is ever present, and calling one's attention to it through, for instance, the awakening mantra of I am conscious of being conscious opens the door as this identity to anything along these lines. You can think on the physical or on the mental plane, and you'll notice that I have here thinkings and feelings and doings and willings and intuitions and cognitions and ideations of the aeon of the ground at the very top that forms, as I said, the fundamental framework or structures by which we live and move and have our being. However, as we look, we see that there are certain dimensions of the self, of the 10-dimensional self. We've spoken of that over and again. The 10-dimensional self, in all its complexity, exists throughout all of the actualizations and the identifications that occur. However, when we stop and we reflect on the natural powers of consciousness, we see that powers of consciousness are best exemplified and expressed on the physical level through our behaviors, through our actions, through our productions, our fabrications, our creations. In the same way that we find that the feeling dimension of self has a unique resonance and ability to master via the identity axis on the kamic, our astral plane, the plane of imagination, and where we develop, if you will, our social intellect. And when it comes to our ability to consider things specifically and concretely, such as Jeff had a fine day, or to consider things abstractly, such as ontology is one of the branches of philosophy. Whether we consider something abstract in terms of general ideas, or whether we consider them as concrete and as particular ideas, those are all aspects of distinctions that we make either according to categories or to sets, classes of individual concrete things. And so it goes with the egoic that allows us, therefore, to develop our personal wisdom. And I use the word scientific wisdom here, back to the meta plane, but I use the word scientific wisdom because this is something which is verified. It's certifiable. And you don't necessarily have to have something certifiable through the experimental inductive method that necessarily involves the I, it. There are other ways to certify, for instance, social wisdom and other ways to certify. So, for instance, in selfology, so I call it the study of self. Well, basically, it's the study of the 10-dimensional self. So when you break down what the self is into its 10 dimensions, then we see that there is a clear reflection as light, illumination, the illumination of consciousness, which is, of course, the I. It is illuminating this entire pyramid like a prism on different levels. So you're going to find the doing dimension having a unique resonance for mastery of the physical plane, the feelings for the emotional, your thinkings for the intellective or mentive plane, your willings, particularly for the egoic plane, where you exist as a transfinite being with all the experiences on the thread of your continuity of consciousness, and you also exist as an empirical self, an empirical being that experiences things finitely, one thing at a time, one event, particular element structured in space, essences such as blue and sounds and tones, and musical chants as well as birdsong. And in the same way that your intuitions naturally have a specific resonance in terms of the mastery of your intuitive senses as well as the I-thou relationship that you have as theos, where your presence involves all presence. And then cognitions have a unique, and cognition here is a simple processes, the ongoing processes of consciousness. Cognizances, on the other hand, are states of consciousness. So you have a state of consciousness when you perceive me talking to you. You have cognition always going on, and which is that string of continuity that is the thread which takes all the finite experiences and transforms them into these things we call transfinities. And then at the very top, ideations, which are the entire sum of possibilities of what any universe will be. So, our unique individualities are the result of our self-identifications at these various planes of existence as we come out of the aeon as a beam of light, flashing through being in all its dimensions. That sum total we call the individuality for each of us as a microcosmic being. I want to emphasize that there are rings, and we've talked about this constantly in terms of the various self. Well, here, I wanted to make it rather simplified for us that when we're talking about the empiric self, the red ring here, we are talking about something that is generated from the empirical ego, which is this little eye, this little oval, red oval that's represented there in this philosophic art. And that ego, all the egos, are eyes in two senses, right? They're the singular I, as we mean, as in I, as myself. And then they're the I, like the eye of Horus, or the eye through which we see. So the ego is how we see the world, but at the same time, remember, it is a dual agency. It doesn't just watch the world, it also acts upon the world. So the way we can act upon the world concretely in its particular ways is starting off here in the egoic realm, where we see ourselves as an individual person within this entire realm and everything below. Our ideas, our feelings, and our individual body with its individual actions are all part of that finite world. In the same way that as a transfinite being that is able to take these experiences and, if you will, lay them against the backdrop of infinity, of the infinity of things that are happening at this given moment, once the imprint is taken and it is transformed through consciousness at the egoic level. Remember, the identity, the consciousness is doing all that automatically. Those are pristine cognitions that are occurring all the time from this level of I am, where each of us exists as a transcendent ego. Here, we exist as an empirical ego. Here, as a transcendental ego. Here is a transcendent ego, and here is an absolute ego. And the absolute ego is, of course, the pointless point, but the point has always been without dimension. The fact that we even think in our bodies that we have a point of consciousness is, of course, an absurd idea. It's an absurd idea because we're taking the realm of I, it, and we're thinking that applies to the point of consciousness, which is not an I, it. Consciousness is I. Simplicitor, I. Consciousness confers identity, and identity certifies consciousness. And it can certify it either in the finite realm through its finite experiences and realizing that in those finite experiences it is threading itself as an epistechai. I am always generating the very experiences, whether they're sensory or whether they're totally internal as imaginal or intellectual. I am generating those, and I realize that as consciousness. Don't call it my consciousness. You don't have to call it your consciousness or my consciousness. That's what you have egos for. You have egos to break up the seamless flow of light into your individuated self. And the fact of the matter that we all have a transcendent self just simply says that that's the self, that ego, the transcendent ego, that's the aperture within our axis of identity that allows us to perceive the universal whole, to appreciate it, to indulge in it, to participate in at that level, even though that level exists right here, right now, because that's part of what is being radiated from the top through being. And these various levels are ways of speaking about the way we divide the world up into the finite world we experience, the transfinite world that we have intra-agency causation, where I am producing my own train of generated thoughts. They are not produced at the cause-effect, consequence, ramified results scenario of the linear finite world. It's generative. There's a subject and an object, and the two are dependent upon one another for experience to occur. So the subject being here, in terms of the epistic self, right on the edge of the buddhi and the ahamkara planes, on the intuitive and the egoic, because that's at the point in which pure reflection of the above through the below happens, and the microcosmic entity that is self-conscious, and this is essentially self-consciousness here. Self-consciousness isn't altogether I, me. Self-consciousness is the sense of one's presence. When that sense of presence is intuitive, it's intuited as a presence which is presencing itself because of a greater presence, and that's the intuitive level of I, thou. And above that is the cognitive level of pure processes of cognition, which are the essence of being. So this breaks down the pyramid of selfhood according to the apertures of self, which is really egoity in its four forms. This relates to long ago when I was talking about this kind of scenario, you see. All I'm doing is I'm presenting in another philosophical piece of art the empiric self here that divides off at the egoic level. And here you see the pyramid and its 7 planes, if you will, represented with the physical, emotive, mental, egoic, right? And at the egoic, it splits off into the empiric and into the transfinite, which is often called the subtle body, where the other is the solid body, because it's relating to all the finite things that are solidly put together in a structure. And then, of course, we have the agnostic self, which is generated through the transcendent ego, not the transcendental. The transcendental, and that phenomenologists, as well as a lot of psychologists and existentialists refer to, that's the transcendental ego, as well as Kant. They're all speaking about the transcendental ego as the necessary conditions that must be present for consciousness to operate as a consciousness of, a consciousness in this world. But remember, there's consciousness of, right? And you can be conscious of your internal contents as well as your external. But you're also consciousness as. So, this, and if you will, you take the pyramid of selfhood, and if you spin it around, here you have, once again, we've spoken of this, you've got the 7 planes of matter, materiality, in finer and finer grades from the top, and then becoming more dense all the way down to the physical, the organic or biotic level. But all of that's part of the universe. And here you'll see the I, it, I, us, I, other, I, me, I, thou, I am, and I. That's all part of the universe. What is the universe? Well, it is a system of cause, entity, time, and space, all being interconnected. And that system is a coherent causal structure. And it has the 3 kinds of causes of emanation, where the entire universe is emanated all at once. Right now, it's happening now. It's never not been happening, and never not will not be happening. That's the emanative structure, and that's necessary for interdependence to even be established. There has to be that emanational causation as a foundation. And then, of course, we spoke of the generational causation that happens to create the psychic and the psychical experiences we all have as self-conscious beings. And then there's productive causation in the universe, which has to do with cause and effect and consequence and results that are ramified from that, as the finite things interact with each other, similar to the way that the transfinite things are interrelated to one another in the psychical realm. Maintaining one's balance is the universal spinning top, of which we're all a part of it. And sometimes we may lose part of a sense of balance in one part, and it gets restored so that we continue on. That universal spinning top, broken down, again, are all the 7 planes, and as I break them down as well, into the 2 planes, the higher and the lower, such as the vital and the biotic, here on the physical. And in the same way, the emotive, you have the imaginal and the appetive. And we spoke of that before, where you have the intellective, which is capable of abstract thought, and the mnemic, which is the concrete factor of memory that fixes everything into these finite forms. So in terms, pardon me, of our natural levels of identity and identification, we see that they fit quite nicely in terms of unifying them according to the omnic structure that we've become so familiar with over the years as we've explicated this form of omniphilosophy that looks at the self. Selfology utilizes the central tool of looking at itself and applying its concepts. At the moment that we are considering these ideas, we're thinking of them in relation to ourselves, and that's to selfologize. So there's a good deal to selfologize on for this session. And with that, I'll leave you with these words. Behave when you must. Be good whenever you can. But above all else, be yourself.